Tarot. It's everywhere. It's on the shelves of witchy bookstores, it's in Urban Outfitters, it's on YouTube, it's on your shelf. We all know tarot as a form of divination, something that professionals do for a small fee or something for you to do to connect with yourself and others. And yet, for most of history, tarot cards were essentially elaborate playing cards. The earliest predecessors of these cards were likely made in Tang Dynasty China. The prototypes of the first full 78 card decks were first played by French and Italian nobles in the 15th century, and they're thought to be predecessors to the playing cards we know today. Tarot first started to adopt a more spiritual aspect in the 18th and 19th centuries. During this time, mysticism, or the practice of becoming one with God, was starting to take meaning outside of the Abrahamic religions. Alternative religions and schools which teach alternative belief systems, known as lodges, started gaining popularity. Usually, these alternative belief systems would include elements of the supernatural, otherwise referred to as the occult. Popular occult practices today involve everything from astrology to palmistry to divination. These occult practices, when combined with mystical practices, are often referred to as high magic, ceremonial magic, or simply magic with a K. The lodges which made use of these occult practices were often selective and secretive, much like modern fraternities. And because of the mystery enshrouding these practices and beliefs, esotericism has become a broad category to refer to these various doctrines. Now, however, in the age of the internet, increased access to information means that these philosophies are now only esoteric in name. There are many practicing occultists today who work independently from lodges, using resources such as books, blogs, and those neat little pamphlets you get in a tarot deck. In the rest of this video, in the spirit of making mystical tarot even more accessible, I will be examining the Crowley-Thoth Tarot Deck. Because, unlike its more popular counterpart, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, the Crowley-Thoth deck explains the origins of the card meanings a bit better. I will be summarizing the story behind the deck's creation, the philosophy behind it, and leave you with what we should keep in mind when we think about the practice of tarot today. The association of mysticism with tarot was popularized by members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, a lodge that was initially founded in 1888. Though it was only around for 16 years, it has had arguably the largest single influence on modern Western esotericism. Even if you haven't heard of the Golden Dawn, you've probably heard of some of its members, including William Butler Yeats, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and Bram Stoker. But we're going to focus on this guy, Aleister Crowley. Edward Alexander Crowley, or Aleister as he later renamed himself, was a mountaineer, chess player, writer, and most notably, the world's most infamous occultist. Crowley was born to a wealthy fundamentalist Christian family in Warwickshire, England. He started rebelling from a young age and would completely reject his Christian upbringing after the death of his father. In fact, it would seem that Crowley made it his lifelong mission to defy the Christian beliefs and lifestyle he found so oppressive as a child. He pursued a rather libertine lifestyle, which the press would crucify him for. He wrote incredibly obscene poetry, and he even called himself the Great Beast 666, even signing off his letters as such. He would gain mythic status in the 60s and 70s as a leading figure of the counterculture movement and bisexual icon, and his lifestyle was seen as a precursor to free love and the popularization of recreational drugs. Many rock artists have paid homage to Crowley, whether directly or indirectly. Mr. Crowley.
I'm closer to the golden dawn, immersed in Crowley's uniform of imagery.
Now, however, Crowley is being scrutinized more closely for his misogynistic, racist, and anti-Semitic views as well as for his failures as a husband and father. Crowley's divisive personality got him kicked out of the Golden Dawn just 2 years after he had joined. And in 1912, he joined the esoteric lodge OTO, short for the Ordo Templi Orientis, so named because it claims lineage to the Knights Templar. Crowley quickly climbed the ranks and became the leader of its British branch and expanded the sex magic curriculum of the OTO to include sex between men. Toward the end of Crowley's life, a woman named Lady Freida Harris, also a member of the OTO, compelled Crowley to create his own tarot deck and write a companion book for which she would provide the tarot illustrations and essays to accompany the deck. Harris also helped finance the project using her society connections. What was initially meant to be a 6-month-long project dragged into a 5-year-long one. The Houghton Library of Rare Books and Manuscripts at Harvard University illuminates some of Harris's painstaking work perfecting the tarot illustrations. In the Houghton collections is an album of Harris's, which includes early drafts and monochrome prints of the tarot cards. Though Harris finished painting the deck and even opened an art exhibition to display her paintings, the deck wasn't published in card form until 1969, years after the deaths of Crowley and Harris. Crowley had titled his deck the Crowley-Thoth Deck, giving Harris credit in the notes of his companion book, the Book of Thoth. It's important to note that ancient Egyptian mythology played a big role in Crowley's magical practice and philosophy. This idea stems from one of the first essays on tarot, written by Antoine Courtegeblin, when he suggested a connection between tarot and the mythical Book of Thoth. This is not a physical book, but rather a collection of texts purported by some to have been written by the Egyptian god of writing, Thoth. Though many of these texts have never been discovered, they're referred to often by early occultists. However, the most commonly used tarot deck today is not the Crowley-Thoth deck, but the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which was published 60 years earlier in 1909 by former members of the Golden Dawn, Arthur Edward Waite and illustrator Pamela Coleman Smith, who has, for a long time, been overlooked in her essential role in the creation of the tarot. Most modern tarot decks are based on the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which itself is based on the Tarot of Marseille, a tarot deck that was used in France for the 17th and 18th centuries, when tarot was still a game. While there had already been an association between tarot and divination within Western esotericism, Waite and Smith brought divinatory tarot into the mainstream. Though Waite wrote a companion book for customers to understand the divinatory meanings of the cards, an explicit description of Golden Dawn philosophy is absent, likely because, like many schools of esoteric philosophy, the Golden Dawn swore its members to secrecy. Eventually, these teachings of the Golden Dawn would be released in 1937, years after the dissolution of the order. Crowley, on the other hand, had always incorporated elements from the teachings of the various secret orders he belonged to, writing reams upon reams of books on Western esotericism and Thelema, the religion he created. Perhaps the most accessible of his teachings, though, is the tarot deck he created with Harris at the end of his life. Though Crowley and Harris's deck is similar to Waite and Smith's deck in many ways, Crowley and Harris's use different symbols, drawing from Thelema and the OTO. They also meant the Crowley-Thoth tarot deck to be used primarily as an educational tool to think about the relationship between the universe and the individual. However, Crowley concedes in his Book of Thoth that one could also use his deck for divination. However, unlike the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, rather than providing simple layouts to use for divination, Crowley details rather elaborate rituals inspired by the Golden Dawn, which involve chanting and the invoking of higher powers. We can also see the differences between the decks reflected in their illustrations. While Smith's style comes from a tradition of Marseille-based tarot, Harris's cards skew more toward abstraction, resembling psychedelic art more than 15th century woodcuts. Ultimately, both the Rider-Waite-Smith and Crowley-Thoth decks have the same general setup and card meanings based on the tarot system first popularized by French occultist Alphonse Louis Constant, better known as Eliphas Lévy, who was, for all intents and purposes, the father of modern occultism. The Golden Dawn took much of Lévy's philosophy and made his interpretation of the tarot canon. Lévy did not create the tarot, of course, but he was one of the first to interpret them seriously, as part of an almost religious mystical practice. Even the earliest tarot decks have 4 suits, or minor arcana, which eventually led to the 4 suits of a modern playing deck. These are the swords, cups, pentacles, otherwise known as discs, and wands. Given these 4 suits, Levy concluded that each of these suits represents one of the 4 elements. Swords represent air, cups represent water, discs represent earth, and wands represent fire. Each of these elements in turn has its own attributes, which change how it's read. But it would be wrong to discuss the origins and influences of the mystical tarot without at least giving a broad overview of what exactly the connection between tarot and mysticism looks like in practice. So in the next section, I will be detailing how Crowley taught tarot, taking his cue from Eliphas Levi and the Golden Dawn. The Kabbalah, a form of Jewish mysticism, has long been a subject of interest to Western esotericism. In many esoteric writings, you'll find the Tree of Life from the Kabbalah. However, the Kabbalah that is mentioned in Crowley's writings is not at all loyal to the Jewish Kabbalah. Rather, it comes from this man, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, who first blended elements of the Jewish Kabbalah and Western esotericism, involving occult fields such as alchemy and astrology. The Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn took Agrippa's Hermetic Kabbalah in tandem with Levi's writings and made them the basis of their practice, influencing Crowley's magical philosophy. In his Book of Thoth, Crowley describes each of the minor arcana cards as an artistic representation of each point on the Tree of Life, though there are slightly different readings depending on the suit. To put it in an astrophysical sense, the 0 represents all that nothingness that came before the Big Bang. A 0 to us, but not nothing in the absence of anything, vulgar sense of the word, as Crowley put it. Following the 0 is the 1. This would be the singularity, the positive form that comes out of the negative space of the nothing, the big 0. What's important here is that, as Crowley puts it, there is no 0 without a 1. There cannot be nothing without something. And just as the existence of a 0 requires the existence of a 1, there cannot be 1 without a 2. In our universe, a point needs to exist in a position, and in order to create the concept of space, there needs to exist another point to create a line. And yet, there needs to be a definite way to measure this distance, and so there must be yet another point, a 3, to create relative distance between one point and the other. On the Tree of Life, these first 3 points form a triangle. This triangle forms a sort of Platonic ideal of the universe. It represents the beginnings of the cosmos and the creation of the space-time fabric. It represents the heavenly, if you will, a holy trinity. Crowley refers to the gap crossing between the heavenly ideal world and the physical world as the abyss. Crossing the abyss is the goal of mystical practice. It's the experience of moving from our physical reality to an abstract, ideal, and heavenly one. In religious visions, this is referred to as reaching enlightenment or seeing God. So the first 3 cards, the Ace, the 2, and the 3, each derive meaning from this Tree of Life. Aces represent potential, the root of the power of all the following cards in the suit. 2s represent an element in its purest form, and these cards are interpreted as masculine energy. On the other hand, the 3s represent the divine feminine, the point that finishes the form of the heavens and gives birth, in a sense, to the physical world. These are not literal genders, but rather ways to describe complementary energies that form our world, which are defined in various terms in different cultures. This divine union of masculine and feminine forces is the basis of Crowley's belief in the divinity of sex magic. Further following the rest of the Kabbalistic tree, the 4th point is the beginning of the physical, tangible world and creates matter. Thus, the 4th card represents stability, like 4 legs to a chair. Following this pattern of binary oppositions, the 5th point is instability and motion. Having created the basic fundamentals of the universe, we move on to 6, consciousness. It lies in the center of the 2 divine energies, connecting all the points together because it represents the state of balance and harmonization. A 6th card represents the height, the greatest potential of any element. But, of course, perfection cannot exist without imperfection. The 7th point represents degeneration, the lowest point of each element. 8s represent self-correction and recovery from the 7th point. These cards are works in progress, not perfect. Whereas the 7th card of the cups was utter debauchery, the 8 of cups represents indolence, which Crowley describes as a situation where everything has been diligently prepared, but laziness or self-doubt prevents a complete success. So far, what rules the physical domain is stability on one hand and motion on the other. This corresponds to achieving perfection and then falling from that perfection, but eventually going through the motions of self-correction. At the end, we have nines. These are similar to sixes in that they represent the full force of a card's element, but rather than representing harmony and perfection, nines represent a suit at its logical conclusion. If we personify these cards as voyagers through each of the points on the Tree of Life, this is what comes of it all, for better or for worse. For instance, while the Nine of Cups represents happiness, the Nine of Swords represents cruelty. And though the nines represent an element at its natural end, the tens are present as a warning, for all of these elements have the potential to be in excess. The Ten of Wands, for example, is labeled oppression. For a suit that represents the force of will, this card acts as a warning about what will happen when that will becomes overbearing. It becomes oppressive. It's important to note that the points of the tree don't represent static sequential stages. They're fluid, representing the transience of existence. Impermanence affecting everything from the life of a fly to the existence of the cosmos, moving from the collapse of a nebula to the birth of a star, or from the expansion of space to its possible future contraction, perhaps causing another singularity. There are many more layers of meaning that have been placed on these cards that I won't go into. For instance, each of the court cards, which are like face cards in a modern playing deck, corresponds to various points on the tree. Connections are also made between the cards in the Hebrew language. Given this basic framework, let's examine the Two of Pentacles card. The twos are associated with pure will, as Crowley puts it, with fire and aggression. However, the pentacles are associated with the earth, with groundedness. According to Crowley, this is the element that encapsulates the other three elements and puts them into material form. Its balance of the other elements creates stability. But, paradoxically, the Two of Pentacles is called change. The twos are supposed to represent the purest, most basic characteristics of an element. So if we associate earth with stability, how is the purest form of earth change? Lady Freida Harris's illustrations give us a clue. Here we see yin and yang, an example of Crowley's frequent incorporation of symbols from other philosophies. Surrounding the yin and yang is a snake eating its tail, which is a weighty ancient symbol known as the Ouroboros. But to further drive the point home, Crowley's Ouroboros is in the shape of an infinity sign. In Crowley's view, there is no stability without change. We can see this represented in the yin and yang. Just how Earth is symbolically all the other elements, the yin and the yang incorporate elements of the other into themselves. This is how balance is created. The emphasis on the number 2 plays a part here by representing duality. Two different yin-yang symbols are engulfed by black and white. Crowley is saying there is no stability without change. And there is arguably nothing more stable than change itself. There will always be change, but it is not linear. It's cyclical, just like the Ouroboros. The Tree of Life also has various connections between different points, which all have their own significance. Some may also read into the meanings of certain groupings on the points of the Tree of Life. In fact, the 22 connections between each of these points also correspond to the 22 cards of the major arcana. These are trump cards that are not associated with suits. For the purposes of this video, I won't go into the meanings of each of these trump cards, but briefly point out the distinctions between the major arcana of the Rider deck and the Thoth deck. In the Rider deck, the 8th trump card is Strength, which in the Thoth deck is Lust. The difference can be drawn from Crowley's belief in the power of sex in the practice of magic. In his Book of Thoth, he says, quote, "Lust implies not only strength, but the joy of strength exercised. It is vigor and the rapture of vigor," unquote. But we do not need to confine our analysis to Crowley's writings. We can also analyze Harris's artwork. Of course, the central figure is a naked female body. She can be read here as the object of lust, as women's bodies are often made symbols of sex and sexual attraction. Or a counter reading of this will point to her position atop the lion. She is in control and empowered, the emblem of strength. Her strength lies in her sexuality. She holds a chalice, symbolic of childbirth, and if we are to take this figure as the divine feminine, her sexuality is indeed the source of all life. Another example is the 20th trump card, which in the Rider deck is Judgment, evocative of the Judeo-Christian belief in the coming of the Last Judgment. The Thoth deck, though, heralds the coming of a new eon. This is a central tenet of Crowley's philosophy. He claimed that civilization is entering what he called the Age of Horus. In Harris's illustration, we can see Horus depicted as an androgynous child, presented with a curious, playful expression of wonder. A more traditional depiction of Horus, with the head of a falcon, lies inside this child spirit. At Horus's feet are 3 fetuses. Circling Horus is what appears to be the universe, represented as the divine feminine. Perhaps this is an abstract depiction of her giving birth to the new eon? Crowley claims we can see the beginnings of the new eon from the, quote, great concentration of political power with the accompanying improvements in the means of travel and communication, with the general advance in philosophy and science, unquote. But, according to Crowley, the most fundamental aspect of the new eon is not the advancement of technology, but the freedom of the individual to find spirituality within oneself. Though Crowley liked to think himself a prophet, he was indeed stating the obvious. He was not the only one to herald the coming of a new eon. Crowley is more of a voice of the milieu of the early to mid-20th century. Does the Age of Aquarius ring any bells?
This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, age of Aquarius.
Yes, we now have the freedom to pick up a tarot deck at our local bookstore and learn about ourselves. But we also have the liberty of being able to access the history behind these cards to dispel the romanticized notions behind esoterica, to reveal the man, or rather, men, behind the curtain. Yes, there are some rather controversial aspects to mystical tarot. First of all, the assertion that it comes from ancient Egyptians and was carried over to Europe by the Roma is completely unfounded. It most likely comes from the early occultists' desire to romanticize and exoticize the tarot and Western esotericism at large. Much, if not most, of the mystical tarot is based on Levy's somewhat arbitrary conjectures. A lot of traditional interpretations of the Jewish Kabbalah have been lost to time, partially because it's primarily an oral tradition, partially because practicing Jews have been so heavily persecuted throughout history. Because of this, many take issue with the cursory use of Jewish imagery and non-Jewish practice. In this view, Western esotericism has wrongfully appropriated elements of Judaism. So, what do we do with tarot? Well, first off, tarot is not going away, nor should it. Many have found that tarot readings have profoundly changed their lives for the better, providing much-needed clarity into their lives and a push to act on what, on some level, they always knew they needed to do. And, to be honest, most people who use the tarot today don't really use the Hermetic Kabbalah. Some have even moved away from traditional readings, keying into their intuition rather than using a companion book. A professional tarot reader once told me that tarot is the, quote, poor man's therapy, unquote. Take that with what you will, but tarot has undeniably changed our idea of magic. Magic has transformed from an exclusionary, pretentious form of high magic into something to practice in your daily life, something to whip out at a party or at a crossroads. In any case, the art is pretty cool. Thanks for watching. For more information and citation, check out the description box below.